My daughter ignored my calls for an entire week. When I finally went to her house, it was pitch dark inside and the air was thick with the burning stench of bleach. I heard faint scratching coming from the walk-in closet in my granddaughter's room. When I ripped the doors open, my hands were shaking. The pale, thin little girl looked up at me and whispered that Dad said Mom went crazy. She told me Dad said she had to hide in there or her mother would hurt her. If you are just tuning in to this story, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a nightmare that unfolded right under my nose. If you have ever had to fight to protect your family, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the rest of my story. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It means the world to me to know who is listening. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a commercial construction inspector here in the United States. My entire career was built on finding the hidden faults in massive structures. I made a living looking for cracks in the foundation's structural voids and hidden rot that could bring a whole building down. I was highly trained to look past the fresh coat of paint and see the ugly truth underneath. I thought I knew exactly how to spot a disaster long before it ever happened. But I completely missed the rot spreading inside my own family. It started with the silence. Rachel, my 35-year-old daughter, usually called me every Sunday evening. We had a strict routine. Ever since my wife passed away a few years ago, Rachel made sure to check on me without fail. But this time Sunday came and went with no call. Monday passed in total silence. By Wednesday, my calls were going straight to her voicemail. Text messages were left unread and unanswered. At first, I tried to convince myself that she was just overwhelmed. She is a highly successful interior designer, always juggling wealthy clients, managing contractors, and fighting tight deadlines. But by the 7th day, my gut was screaming at me. A man who has lived as long as I have learns to listen closely when his instincts begin to sound the alarm. I drove over to her house on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. It was a beautiful, sprawling property in an upscale suburban neighborhood, a house easily worth over $1 million. The lawns were perfectly manicured. The driveway was spotless. From the outside, it was the absolute picture of the ideal American dream. But as I walked up the paved stone path to the front door, the silence felt incredibly heavy. The air felt stagnant. It felt completely wrong. I pulled out my spare key and unlocked the heavy mahogany front door. I pushed it open and stepped inside. I did not bother calling out her name right away because the second I crossed the threshold, a physical wave of foul air hit my face. The house was entirely dark. The heavy curtains were drawn tight across every window, blocking out the afternoon sun. But it was the smell that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was an overpowering, burning stench of bleach. But my trained nose knew instantly that this was not normal household cleaning bleach. This was industrial. It smelled sharply of muriatic acid, the kind of harsh chemical heavy contractors use to strip concrete, clean heavy masonry, or dissolve biological matter. It burned the back of my throat and made my eyes water immediately. Why would a luxury house like this smell like a hazardous construction site? I closed the front door behind me. My hand instinctively dropped to my belt, resting firmly on the heavy steel flashlight I always carried. I clicked the light on. The bright beam cut through the dim, shadowy living room. I scanned the area carefully. There was no sign of a physical struggle. There was no broken furniture scattered around. There was no shattered glass on the floor. But right in the middle of the room, half of the expensive custom living room rug had been ripped up and completely removed, leaving the bare, rough subfloor exposed. The sharp chemical smell was radiating strongly from that exact spot. I drew a shaky breath, fighting the burning sensation in my lungs, and started walking toward the stairs. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I climbed the steps one by one, listening to the absolute dead silence of a house that should have been filled with the joyous noise of my 7-year-old granddaughter, Lily. Every step felt like walking deeper into a nightmare. My knees ached from my age, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins pushed the pain away. I needed to find my family. I reached the second-floor landing. The doors to the master bedroom and the guest room were wide open and completely empty. I walked slowly down the hall toward Lily's room at the very end. The door was closed. I gripped the brass handle and turned it. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was perfectly neat. Her toys were put away in their bins. Her bed was perfectly made with its pink comforter. I was about to turn around and check the backyard when I heard it. It was very faint at first. A soft, rhythmic sound. I held my breath and stood perfectly still in the middle of the room. There it was again. A desperate, muffled scratching sound. It was coming from the large walk-in closet in the corner of the room. I moved toward the closet quickly. I grabbed the handle of the bifold doors and pulled. It was locked from the outside. A crude, heavy padlock had been installed high up on the frame. That was the moment the sheer panic truly set in. Nobody puts a padlock on the outside of a child's closet. I gripped my heavy steel flashlight, raised it high, and brought it down hard on the cheap metal latch. The wood splintered with a loud crack. I hit it again, putting the full weight and strength of my 70 years behind the blow. The metal lock snapped loudly and fell to the floor. I ripped the doors open, throwing them back forcefully on their tracks. I shined my flashlight into the dark space and my heart shattered into a million pieces. Lily was huddled in the deepest, darkest corner of the closet. She was pulled into a tight ball, her knees tucked all the way up to her chest. She was trembling uncontrollably. Scattered around her on the floor were a dozen empty juice boxes and a few torn snack wrappers. She looked incredibly pale, her skin almost translucent in the harsh light of my flashlight. Her clothes were wrinkled and soiled from sitting in the dark for God knows how long. She did not scream when the door opened. She did not cry. That was the absolute most terrifying part. A child should cry out when they are scared. But Lily just looked up at me with hollow, completely empty eyes. They were the blank eyes of a child who had seen things she could not possibly process. I dropped to my knees immediately. I tossed the flashlight aside and reached out to her. I told her it was Grandpa and that she was safe now. I coaxed her to come to me. I gently pulled her trembling body into my arms. She felt so small, so incredibly fragile against my chest. She clung to my shirt, burying her face deep into my shoulder. I stroked her tangled hair, trying desperately to hold back my own tears. I asked her softly what had happened and where her mother was. She tilted her head back just enough to look at me. Her lips were dry and cracked. She looked at me, her voice barely a rough, exhausted whisper. She said Dad told her that Mom went crazy. She said Dad told her she had to hide in the closet or her mother would hurt her. The words hit me like a massive physical blow. Dad said Mom went crazy. Derek, my own son-in-law. The polished, smooth-talking luxury real estate broker. He had locked his own daughter in a dark closet. He had told her that her own mother was going to hurt her. My analytical mind started racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. If Rachel went crazy, where was she now? Why would a father lock his child in a closet instead of taking her to safety? Why did the living room downstairs smell like industrial acid? The pieces were not fitting together. The math was entirely wrong. I stood up quickly, lifting Lily securely into my arms. She buried her face in my neck again, wrapping her arms tightly around me. I knew I had to get her out of that toxic house immediately. I reached into my pocket with my free hand and pulled out my cell phone. My fingers were clumsy with pure adrenaline as I unlocked the screen. I needed to dial 911. I needed the police here right now to figure this out. I opened the keypad and pressed the number 9. But before I could press the next digit, a massive, terrifying sound echoed through the silent house. The heavy wooden front door downstairs slammed open with violent force. The impact shook the walls. I froze completely, my thumb hovering right over the screen of my phone. The brief silence was shattered by the sound of heavy, rushed footsteps crossing the hardwood foyer. Whoever it was, they were moving fast and with absolute purpose. The footsteps hit the bottom of the wooden staircase. One heavy thud after another, Someone was running up the stairs, taking them two at a time. I tightened my protective grip on Lily. I looked down the hallway, the only exit blocked by the person charging up the steps. The real nightmare had just arrived, and I was entirely out of time. The heavy footsteps pounded against the hardwood floor of the hallway, growing louder and more frantic with every passing second. I braced myself, shielding Lily behind my body, aiming the heavy beam of my flashlight toward the open doorway. A figure lunged into the room. It was Derek. My son-in-law stood in the doorway, chest heaving, gasping for air, as if he had just run a marathon. He looked absolutely wrecked. His expensive dress shirt was untucked and torn at the collar. His face was covered in thick, dark stubble, and his eyes were completely bloodshot, darting wildly around the room until they locked onto Lily. He let out a loud, agonizing sob that seemed to tear through his throat. He threw himself to the floor, sliding across the carpet on his knees, and wrapped his arms around my granddaughter. He buried his face in her shoulder, crying loudly, begging for her forgiveness, telling her how sorry he was that he took so long to find her. Lily did not hug him back. She just stood there, completely rigid, her small hands clutching my jacket. I was frozen in place, trying to process the sudden explosion of emotion. Before I could even ask him where he had been or what had happened to my daughter, Derek reached out and snatched my cell phone right out of my hand. He did not hesitate. His fingers hammered the screen, dialing 911. He brought the phone to his ear, his hand visibly shaking. When the dispatcher answered, his voice broke into a pitch-perfect tone of pure, unadulterated panic. He screamed into the receiver that he needed help immediately, that his wife was missing, that his daughter had been locked in a closet, and that he feared the absolute worst. He gave the address to Idris through violent, choking sobs. It was the performance of a lifetime, a masterful display of a desperate father and a terrified husband. I stepped back, watching him pace the floor of the bedroom. He ran his hands through his messy hair, muttering to himself, pacing back and forth while he waited for the authorities. Every gesture, every ragged breath seemed meticulously designed to project complete exhaustion and despair. Within 10 minutes, the quiet suburban street was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. The shrill wail of police sirens pierced the silent neighborhood. Heavy boots rushed through the front door, and suddenly the house was swarming with uniformed officers. They swept through the rooms, calling out clear commands, securing the perimeter. A team of paramedics rushed upstairs to check on Lily. I stood in the corner of the hallway, watching the chaotic scene unfold. A tall, serious-looking detective in a gray suit approached Derek. He introduced himself and gently guided my son-in-law away from the paramedics, leading him toward the top of the stairs for a private conversation. But they were just close enough for me to hear every single word. I listened intently, my heart hammering a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. The detective asked Derek to explain exactly what happened. Derek took a deep, shaky breath, wiping tears from his bloodshot eyes. He looked down at the floor, perfectly acting out the role of a man completely crushed by shame and sorrow. He told the detective a flawless, terrifying story. He claimed that Rachel had suffered a severe secret relapse of postpartum psychosis. He explained that years ago, right after Lily was born, Rachel had experienced a brief mental break, something they had kept entirely private within their marriage. He said they had managed it with therapy and medication, and she had been perfectly fine for years. But recently, according to Derek, the darkness had returned with a vengeance. He said she had been secretly flushing her pills down the sink, hiding her spiraling mental state from everyone, including me. Derek told the detective that a few nights ago he woke up to find Rachel completely unhinged. He claimed she was hallucinating violently, screaming about invisible toxins infecting the house. He pointed downstairs toward the living room, his voice trembling, and explained that Rachel had frantically ripped up the expensive carpet with her bare hands, pouring industrial bleach everywhere to cleanse the floors of imaginary demons. He said he tried to stop her, but she struck him while he locked their terrified daughter inside the walk-in closet and fled out the front door into the freezing night. The detective listened silently, scribbling notes on his small pad, his expression reflecting deep concern. Derek did not stop there. He anticipated the obvious question before the detective even had to ask it. "Why didn't you call the police immediately?" Derek broke down again, his shoulders shaking with fresh sobs. He claimed he was blinded by shame and absolute terror. He said he thought he could handle it himself, that he could find her and bring her back before anyone found out about her mental collapse. He told the officer that he had spent the last 3 days and nights driving relentlessly across state lines. He swore he had checked every cheap motel, every hospital, and every gas station within a 200-mile radius. He said he had been running on zero sleep, entirely consumed by the desperate need to save his broken family. He painted himself as a tragic hero, a man who had sacrificed his own well-being to protect his wife's dignity and his daughter's safety. I watched the officers react to his harrowing tale. I saw their stern professional expressions soften entirely. Their posture relaxed. They looked at Derek not as a suspect in a domestic incident, but with genuine, profound pity. They offered him sympathetic nods and murmurs of reassurance. They patted his shoulder, telling him he did the best he could under impossible circumstances. They completely bought his narrative. It was the perfect alibi constructed with just enough painful truth about postpartum struggles to make it completely unassailable. But I stood quietly, in the shadows of the hallway, analyzing every detail of the scene. I watched the way Derek's eyes darted toward the officers, assessing their reactions, measuring their belief. I saw the calculated precision behind his tears. A father who truly believed his young child was in mortal danger would not have ever driven across state lines for 3 days while she was locked in a dark closet. A husband desperately searching for his mentally ill wife would have immediately called her father for help. The story was entirely too smooth, too neatly packaged for a man supposedly in the middle of a catastrophic family emergency. A cold, heavy knot began to form deep in the pit of my stomach. My 40 years of inspecting structural integrity had taught me how to recognize when a load-bearing beam was hollow inside. Derek's story was a hollow beam. It was a meticulously crafted lie designed to cover up a much darker, far more sinister truth. I stood in the darkness staring at his perfectly orchestrated performance, and I knew with absolute chilling certainty that my beautiful daughter had not simply run away from her life. The bedroom door practically exploded inward with a deafening crash. Derek stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, gasping for air as if his lungs were collapsing. His expensive linen shirt was ripped at the collar and completely soaked in sweat. His face was covered in a thick, dark shadow of stubble, and his eyes were wild bloodshot and darting frantically around the room until they finally locked onto Lily. He let out a loud, agonizing sob that seemed to tear through his throat. He threw himself onto the floor, sliding across the soft carpet on his knees, and wrapped his arms tightly around my granddaughter. He buried his face in her shoulder, crying loudly, begging for her forgiveness, telling her how desperately sorry he was that he took so long to find her. Lily did not hug him back. She just stood there, completely rigid, her small hands clutching my jacket. I was frozen in place, trying to process the sudden violent explosion of emotion, before I could even open my mouth to ask him where he had been or what had happened to my daughter. Derek reached out and snatched my cell phone right out of my hand. He did not hesitate. His fingers hammered the screen, dialing emergency services. He brought the phone to his ear, his hand shaking. When the dispatcher answered, his voice broke into a perfect tone of pure panic. He screamed into the receiver that he needed help immediately, that his wife was missing, that his daughter had been locked in a closet, and that he feared the absolute worst. He gave the address through violent, choking sobs. It was the performance of a lifetime, a masterful display of a desperate father and a terrified husband. I stepped back, watching him pace the bedroom floor. He ran his hands through his messy hair, muttering to himself, pacing back and forth while he waited for the authorities. Every gesture, every ragged breath seemed meticulously designed to project complete exhaustion and despair. Within 10 minutes, the quiet suburban street was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. The shrill wail of police sirens pierced the silent neighborhood. Heavy boots rushed through the front door, and suddenly the house was swarming with uniformed officers. They swept through the rooms, calling out clear commands, securing the perimeter. Paramedics rushed upstairs to check on Lily. I stood in the corner of the hallway, watching the chaotic scene unfold. A tall, serious-looking detective in a gray suit approached Derek. He introduced himself and gently guided my son-in-law away from the paramedics, leading him toward the top of the stairs for a private conversation. But they were close enough for me to hear every word. I listened intently, my heart hammering a steady rhythm against my ribs. The detective asked Derek to explain exactly what had happened. Derek took a deep, shaky breath, wiping tears from his bloodshot eyes. He looked down at the floor, acting out the role of a man completely crushed by shame and sorrow. He claimed that Rachel had suffered a severe secret relapse of postpartum psychosis. He explained that years ago, right after Lily was born, Rachel experienced a brief mental break, something they kept entirely private within their marriage. They had managed it with therapy and medication, and she was perfectly fine for years. But recently, Derek said the darkness had returned with a vengeance. He said she had been secretly flushing her pills down the bathroom sink, hiding her spiraling mental state from everyone, including me. Derek told the detective that a few nights ago he woke up to find Rachel completely unhinged. He claimed she was hallucinating violently, screaming about invisible toxins infecting the entire house. He pointed downstairs toward the living room, his voice trembling, and explained that Rachel had frantically ripped up the expensive carpet with her bare hands, pouring industrial bleach everywhere to cleanse the floors of imaginary demons. He said he tried to stop her, but she struck him, locked their terrified daughter inside the walk-in closet, and fled out the front door into the freezing night. To back up his story, Derek reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He handed it to the detective. I could clearly see the official stamps of a psychiatric clinic right on the front page. The documents detailed violent paranoia and severe delusions, all bearing Rachel's name. The detective reviewed the papers carefully, his expression shifting from skeptical to deeply sympathetic. While they spoke, another uniformed officer came running up the stairs, holding a police radio. He reported that they had pulled the neighborhood traffic camera footage. The video showed Rachel's silver SUV speeding out of the subdivision at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning 3 days ago. The physical evidence was damning. The stamped psychiatric evaluations and the confirmed traffic camera footage created an impenetrable wall of proof. The police officers exchanged knowing, somber looks. They saw a tragedy, a broken family destroyed by mental illness, not a crime. I stepped forward, raising my voice, demanding they dig deeper. I told them about the industrial acid smell downstairs, insisting that no housewife uses muriatic acid to clean a living room floor. I pleaded with them to test the exposed wood, to search the perimeter, to see past this illusion. But my desperate words bounced off their preconceived conclusions. The tall detective turned slowly to face me. He closed his notebook with a definitive hollow snap. He looked at me with an expression of pity, the kind of look you give a grieving man who is in denial. He sighed heavily. "I am sorry, Mr. Caldwell. Your daughter is a voluntarily missing adult experiencing a severe mental health crisis. Based on the medical history and the video evidence, there is no crime scene here. We will issue a silver alert for her vehicle, but we cannot treat this as a homicide or an abduction. She left of her own free will." The finality of his words felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. I looked over at Lily, praying she would speak up and tell the police what she had told me. I knelt beside her, gently holding her hands, asking her to repeat what her father had said to her. But the trauma had taken a devastating toll. Her small jaw was clenched shut. Her eyes were locked onto the floor, vacant. She had descended into a state of selective mutism, unable to utter a single syllable to save her mother. Derek stepped forward, placing a firm, possessive hand on her trembling shoulder. Armed with his rights as her biological father, he told the police he needed to take Lily to his house to protect her from the trauma of this environment. I argued, I begged, I demanded they let her stay with me, but I was legally powerless. The law favored the biological father. I was forced to stand in the hallway, paralyzed by the boundaries of the legal system, and watch my son-in-law drive his car away with my granddaughter, taking my last shred of hope with him. I drove back to my empty house in a complete daze. The silence inside my own home had never felt so suffocating. I sat down at my kitchen table and buried my face in my hands. The image of Lily trembling in that dark closet was burned into my mind. The sound of Derek playing the perfect broken husband echoed endlessly in my ears. For the first hour, the overwhelming grief and fear paralyzed me. I felt like a failure as a father and a grandfather. But then slowly, the heavy fog of emotion began to clear. I wiped my face and sat up straight. I had spent 40 years as a commercial construction inspector. My entire livelihood depended on my ability to walk into a chaotic, messy environment and immediately spot the things that did not belong. I was trained to look past the surface, to ignore the contractor selling me a smooth story, and to look strictly at the physical evidence. I closed my eyes and mentally walked back through Rachel's house. I replayed the entire afternoon in my head, frame by frame, analyzing every sensory detail. And as my professional instincts took over, the sheer terror transformed into a cold, focused clarity. 3 specific details emerged from the chaos. 3 distinct anomalies that completely shattered Derek's flawless narrative. First, I thought about the smell that had hit me when I opened her front door. Derek had told the police that Rachel was scrubbing the floors with bleach in a fit of manic paranoia. The officers accepted that explanation without a second thought. But I have spent decades on heavy masonry sites and concrete pours. I know the exact chemical signature of every cleaning agent used in residential and commercial builds. What I smelled in my daughter's living room was not standard household bleach. It did not have that basic chlorine scent you find under a kitchen sink. It was muriatic acid. Muriatic acid is a highly corrosive, incredibly dangerous chemical solution used by professional contractors to strip cured concrete, dissolve heavy mortar, or eliminate deep biological stains. It is a harsh lung-burning substance that requires heavy-duty respirators and thick rubber gloves to handle safely. A woman experiencing a sudden psychological break does not casually go out and purchase commercial-grade muriatic acid to clean a living room subfloor. That specific chemical is used when someone needs to destroy physical evidence at a microscopic level. It is used to erase mistakes permanently. The realization sent a sharp chill down my spine. Derek was not cleaning up after a mentally ill wife. He was meticulously sanitizing a very specific area of that floor. The second detail involved the neighborhood traffic camera photograph the police officer had shown me. The image captured Rachel's silver sport utility vehicle speeding past the subdivision exit gates at 2 o'clock in the morning. The officer pointed to the blurry shape behind the steering wheel and declared it was my daughter. But my mind reconstructed the geometry of that driver's seat. Rachel is a petite woman. She is barely 5 feet and 3 inches tall. Whenever she drives her vehicle, she sits incredibly close to the steering wheel, and she never uses the overhead sun visor because it blocks her line of sight completely. But in that grainy police photograph, the driver's side sun visor was pulled all the way down, flush against the windshield. That specific visor position is only necessary and only physically possible to drive with if the person behind the wheel is over 6 feet tall and leaning far back in the seat. Derek is 6 feet and 2 inches tall. The person driving Rachel's car out of that neighborhood in the dead of night was hiding their face from the exit cameras. It was not a terrified, hallucinating mother fleeing her home. It was a tall man ensuring his features were perfectly obscured from the glaring streetlights. Derek had planted the car somewhere else to establish a false trail. The third and most damning detail was what I saw on Derek's feet. When he burst into Lily's bedroom putting on that spectacular show of grief, I had looked down. His heavy leather work boots were completely coated in a thick, dark red clay. The clay was caked deep into the heavy treads of his soles, still slightly damp. Rachel's neighborhood, and my entire side of the county, is built on rich black loam soil. You could dig 10 feet down in her backyard, and you would never find a single trace of red dirt. I know the geological makeup of this city like the back of my hand. There is only one specific location in our entire municipal district that contains that heavy iron-rich red clay. It is the abandoned commercial excavation zone on the far east side of town. It is a desolate area filled with half-finished concrete foundations and bankrupt construction projects that stalled years ago. Why would a man who claimed to be desperately driving from motel to motel across state lines have fresh east side excavation clay packed tightly into the treads of his boots? He had not been driving on the highway. He had been digging or walking through a muddy, unfinished construction site right here in our own city. The three pieces of the puzzle clicked together in my mind with terrifying precision. The muriatic acid on the floor, the tall driver hiding behind the sun visor, the fresh red clay from an abandoned commercial zone. Derek was constructing a masterpiece of deception. He had orchestrated every single detail to manipulate the authorities, and the system had swallowed his lies completely. The police were completely useless to me now. If I went to the precinct today and presented my wild theories about soil samples and sun visor angles, they would politely show me the door. They already viewed me as an emotional, grieving father, desperately grasping at straws to avoid the painful truth. They had closed their official notebooks. They were convinced that Derek was the tragic victim. If I confronted Derek directly with what I knew, the consequences would be catastrophic. He was a cornered animal wearing a very polite human mask. If he realized that I saw straight through his flawless alibi, he would not hesitate to take drastic action. He already had full legal custody of Lily. He could pack her into his vehicle tonight, drive directly across the state line, and simply vanish into the wind before I could even draft a basic legal injunction. I could not let him know that I suspected a single thing. I had to play the exact role he expected me to play. I needed to be the broken, clueless old man who fully believed his tragic narrative without question. But more than anything else, I needed to get Lily out of his physical control. I could not leave my granddaughter in the hands of a monster. I needed a tactical excuse to get her back into my house safely without raising any suspicion. I sat there in the complete silence of my empty kitchen, plotting my very next strategic move. I knew with absolute certainty that using any kind of aggressive brute force would get me nowhere. If I showed up at Derek's parents' house angry and making wild accusations, he would call the police and have me arrested for trespassing. He had the legal upper hand, and he had the perfect cover story. To beat a master manipulator, I had to play a role even more convincing than his. I had to become the absolute opposite of a physical threat to him. I needed to become a pathetic, broken, dying old man. The very next morning, I did not take a shower or shave. I put on a wrinkled shirt and a worn-out pair of slacks. I wanted to look exactly like a grieving father who had entirely given up on life. I drove my truck slowly across town, rehearsing every single physical movement I was about to make. When I pulled up to his parents' beautiful 2-story house, I saw Derek standing in the front yard. He was talking to an older couple next door, gesturing sadly, no doubt feeding them the same tragic tale he had sold to the police. The audience was perfectly positioned for my performance. I slowly stepped out of my truck and intentionally stumbled forward. I dragged my feet across the manicured lawn, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders slumped. Derek stopped talking to the neighbors and turned to look at me, his eyes narrowing with a flash of intense irritation. He clearly did not want me ruining his neighborhood performance. I did not give him the chance to speak. As soon as I reached the bottom step of the concrete porch, I let out a sharp, breathless gasp. I grabbed the center of my chest with both hands and fell forward, dropping heavily onto my knees against the hard pavement. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, making a wet, choking sound in the back of my throat. The older woman next door screamed in shock and rushed toward the property line. Derek had no choice but to react. He ran over to me, grabbing my shoulders, his voice laced with a panicked urgency that I knew was entirely for the benefit of the watching neighbors. I squeezed my eyes shut, letting out a weak, agonizing moan, and leaned my full body weight against his arms. I whispered that my heart was failing, that the pain was crushing my chest, that losing my daughter was finally killing me. I felt Derek tense up. He was trapped. He could not throw a dying old man off his front porch in broad daylight. The neighbor was already on her phone, frantically shouting my symptoms to an emergency dispatcher. Within minutes, an ambulance pulled into the driveway. 2 paramedics rushed over with a heavy medical bag and a portable electrocardiogram machine. They laid me flat on the porch, attaching cold, sticky sensor pads to my chest and arms. I continued to play my part perfectly, keeping my eyes half closed and my breathing labored. After a few tense minutes of monitoring, the lead paramedic let out a slow sigh of relief. He looked up at Derek and explained that I was not having a major cardiac event. He said it appeared to be a severe stress-induced angina attack, brought on by extreme emotional trauma and physical exhaustion. He recommended that I go to the hospital for a full evaluation, but I immediately shook my head. I reached out with a trembling, frail hand and grabbed Derek by the sleeve of his expensive shirt. I looked up at him with tears streaming down my face. I cried openly, letting the tears soak into my collar. I told him that I did not want to go to a hospital, to die alone in a cold room. I told him that my heart was just broken into pieces because Rachel was gone. The paramedics packed up their equipment, advising Derek to keep a very close eye on me and to make sure I rested. The trap was set perfectly. I had established myself as a completely harmless, shattered man. Derek stood there looking down at me with a mixture of disgust and absolute superiority. He truly believed he had won. He believed I was a pathetic, ruined shell of a man who posed absolutely no threat to his grand scheme. I looked up at him, my voice cracking, and played my final desperate card. I begged him. I sobbed, telling him that my house was so incredibly empty, and the silence was driving me to the brink of death. I pleaded with him to let Lily come home with me for just a few days. I told him that seeing her face was the only reason I had left to keep breathing. I cried that I needed my granddaughter to give me a reason to wake up tomorrow. Derek hesitated. I could see the cold calculations running behind his eyes. He weighed the risks. If he said no to a grieving, dying grandfather right in front of the sympathetic neighbors, he would look like a cruel monster. But if he said yes, he would cement his image as the ultimate forgiving, generous family man. His narcissism was his greatest weakness, and I used it to tear Lily right out of his grip. He sighed, putting on a gentle, sad smile for the audience. He knelt beside me, patting my shoulder, and said that if it would help me heal, Lily could stay with me for the week. He helped me to my feet, playing the dutiful son-in-law to perfection. I buckled Lily in the back seat of my truck, my hands shaking for real this time, but out of pure relief. I drove away from that house at a painstakingly slow pace, maintaining the illusion of a weak old man until I was several miles down the familiar road. As soon as I pulled into my own garage and the heavy metal door closed behind us, the entire fabricated facade dropped away instantly. I stood up straight. My breathing steadied. The frailty vanished completely from my bones. I brought Lily inside, set her up in the warm guest room with her favorite soft blankets and a hot meal, and meticulously locked every single door and window in the house. She was finally secure and safe, and now I could finally begin my counteroffensive. I walked into my quiet home office, sat at the desk, and picked up the phone. I had 2 critical phone calls to make today. The first was to Mitchell Ross, a seasoned veteran family lawyer who owed me a massive personal favor from our younger days. I needed heavy legal firepower to completely stall whatever devious maneuver Derek was planning next. The second call was to Victor, a brilliant private investigator famously known for his absolute discretion and his ability to track hidden, encrypted dark web finances. Derek genuinely thought he had buried me alive, but he had absolutely no idea he had just blindly handed me the key to his own spectacular destruction. I met Victor at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town just past midnight. The neon sign buzzed loudly in the damp night air, casting a flickering red glow across the empty parking lot. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth at the very back of the restaurant facing the door. Victor arrived 10 minutes later, slipping into the seat across from me like a shadow. He was a man who practically lived in the digital underground, completely unbothered by normal social conventions. Without offering a greeting, he opened a scuffed metal briefcase and pulled out a sleek, heavily modified laptop. He ordered a cup of black coffee from the extremely tired waitress, waited patiently for her to walk away, and then slowly turned the screen toward me. Victor simply did not deal in theories or wild guesses. He dealt in hard, undeniable data. Within just a few hours, his digital excavation had completely bypassed the polished public facade Derek had spent years carefully constructing. Derek presented himself to the world as a highly successful elite luxury real estate broker. He drove a pristine sports car, wore bespoke Italian suits, and constantly posted photos from exclusive country clubs and high-end charity galas. It was all a meticulously crafted illusion. The man was a complete fraud. Victor tapped a few keys, pulling up a series of banking records and state licensing databases. He pointed to a rapidly declining line graph on the screen. Derek had not closed a single major property deal in 18 months. His real estate license was currently under quiet review by the State Board for severe ethical violations and misappropriation of client escrow funds. The lavish lifestyle he flaunted was being funded entirely by a mountain of high-interest credit cards and reckless personal loans. But the fake career was only the very first layer of the rotting onion. Victor took a slow sip of his coffee and brought up a new window on his screen. This one was filled with lines of complex code and heavily encrypted ledger transfers. He had tracked Derek through a labyrinth of dark web financial transactions, peeling back the digital disguises one by one. What Victor uncovered next made my blood run absolutely cold. The real reason Derek was so desperate, the reason he was unraveling, was not just about maintaining his fake wealthy image. It was about pure survival. Victor traced a series of massive panicked wire transfers to shell companies located in Eastern Europe and the Caribbean. Derek was a degenerate gambler. He owed over $3 million to a highly illegal, exceptionally violent offshore sports betting syndicate. This was not the kind of debt you could simply discharge in bankruptcy court. These were men who collected their dues in blood and broken bones. Victor pulled up a series of intercepted text messages from a burner phone registered under a fake name but tied to Derek through his vehicle navigation system. The messages were terrifyingly blunt. The syndicate had given Derek a hard, non-negotiable 2-week deadline to liquidate his assets and pay the $3 million in full. If he failed to deliver the money, he would face lethal consequences. They had even sent him a photograph of his own house taken from the street at night, just to prove they were watching him. The sheer gravity of the situation slammed into my chest. Every single breath felt incredibly heavy as the terrible, suffocating reality settled over me. I realized that my precious daughter was currently sleeping in a house with a desperate monster who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Derek was a cornered animal facing imminent destruction. He needed a massive injection of liquid cash immediately, and he had absolutely no legitimate way to get it. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen, feeling a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the terrifying math suddenly clicked into place. The final puzzle piece locked in, and the true horror of Derek's master plan revealed itself in my mind. Before my wife passed away, we had set up a substantial financial safety net for our daughter. Rachel had a $5 million untouchable trust fund. It was ironclad, designed specifically to protect her from financial predators and ensure she would always be taken care of. The stipulations of the trust were extremely strict. Under normal circumstances, Derek could not touch a single penny of that money. Even as her husband, he had zero legal authority over the principal amount. But Derek had found a loophole, a dark and twisted path to that fortune. If Rachel were to die unexpectedly, the trust would not default to him. It would go into a lengthy probate process and eventually pass directly down to Lily, overseen by a court-appointed financial guardian. Derek knew that I would fight him with every last ounce of my strength to become that guardian. A dead wife did him absolutely no good financially. He needed Rachel alive but entirely incapacitated. He needed her to be declared legally incompetent by a medical professional and a judge. If Rachel suffered a catastrophic mental breakdown, if she was institutionalized and deemed completely unfit to manage her own affairs, the legal landscape shifted dramatically. As her lawful husband and the father of their child, Derek could file an emergency petition for total legal conservatorship. He could argue that he needed immediate access to the trust fund to pay for her indefinite, specialized medical care and to maintain a stable home environment for their young daughter. It was a brilliantly evil strategy. Once granted full conservatorship, he could easily siphon off the $3 million to pay his gambling debts, hiding the massive withdrawals under the guise of exorbitant private medical expenses and ongoing legal fees. He had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. The sudden, inexplicable shifts in Rachel's mood, the missing medication, the gaslighting, the staged outbursts in public. He had been slowly and deliberately poisoning her mind, driving her toward a complete psychological collapse just so he could seize control of her trust fund and save his own pathetic life. The realization washed over me like a wave of freezing water. Rachel was not losing her mind. She was being systematically destroyed by the man who had sworn to protect her. And now time was rapidly running out. The syndicate gave Derek a 2-week deadline. That meant Derek had to finalize his conservatorship and gain access to the funds within 14 days. My daughter was in imminent danger. Every single day she remained under his control, she was being pushed closer to an irreversible breaking point. I thanked Victor, paid him in cash, and walked out into the cold night. My sorrow was gone. It had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculated rage. I had the truth, I had the motive, and I had my granddaughter perfectly safe in my own home. Now I just needed to patiently spring the trap. I was going to ruthlessly tear his world apart piece by piece until nothing remained of his lies. He picked a fight with the wrong man. The drive back from the diner was quiet, the dark Montana highways stretching out ahead of me like an empty canvas. I arrived home just before dawn, stepping softly into the guest bedroom where Lily was fast asleep. Looking down at her innocent, peaceful face, I felt a fleeting sense of security. I had the evidence. I had Victor's data. I believed I held all the cards, and that morning I intended to hand everything over to Mitchell, my longtime legal counsel, to begin dismantling Derek's life. But I severely underestimated the sheer desperation of a cornered animal. Greed and terror make a man entirely unpredictable, and Derek was running out of time. At precisely 7 o'clock in the morning, just as the first rays of sunlight hit the kitchen counter, my phone began to violently vibrate. It was Mitchell. When I answered, there was no standard greeting, no calm professionalism. His voice was breathless, strained, and filled with a rare, panicked urgency that instantly made my stomach drop. He told me to sit down, explaining that Derek had just blindsided us with a massive legal strike. Mitchell explained that less than an hour ago, Derek and his high-priced legal team had bypassed standard court procedures entirely. They had filed an emergency ex parte motion in family court. In the legal world, an ex parte motion is a terrifying weapon because it is designed to be handled in absolute secrecy. It meant a judge was reviewing a massive, devastating petition without our knowledge, without our presence, and without giving us any opportunity to defend ourselves or present our side of the story. Derek had struck hard fast and entirely from the shadows, catching us completely off guard. The core of his motion was an aggressive, immediate demand for a full conservatorship over Rachel's entire estate. My hands began to shake as Mitchell read the details of the filing over the phone. Derek was not waiting for Rachel to slowly unravel anymore. He had accelerated his timeline drastically, desperate to appease the violent offshore gambling syndicate before his 2-week deadline expired. He was moving in for the kill, intending to legally strip his own wife of her autonomy and seize total control of her life. The foundation of Derek's entire legal assault rested on a mountain of absolute lies meticulously constructed over the past several months. He had submitted the fabricated psychiatric files, the doctored medical reports, and the falsified evaluations from the corrupt doctor he had secretly paid off. In the paperwork, Derek painted a horrific, completely distorted picture of Rachel. He claimed she was suffering from severe treatment-resistant psychosis, making her an immediate danger to herself and everyone around her. The narrative his lawyers presented to the judge was chillingly persuasive. They argued that Rachel was in the middle of a catastrophic psychological break, entirely detached from reality, and actively trying to flee or harm herself. Because of this fabricated emergency, Derek was demanding immediate, unrestricted access to Rachel's $5 million trust fund. He claimed the money was urgently required to fund specialized search and rescue efforts, intensive private security, and immediate placement in a secure, high-end psychiatric facility. It was a flawless piece of legal theater. To the unsuspecting judge, Derek looked like a deeply distraught, devoted husband, desperately trying to save his unstable wife. In reality, he was a ruthless predator, using the legal system to bankroll his own survival and pay off a $3 million debt to dangerous criminals. But Derek's cruelty did not stop with Rachel. To ensure his plan succeeded, he knew he had to completely neutralize me. He knew I was the only person alive who would fight him to the bitter end, the only one who truly understood his capacity for evil. To eliminate me from the legal equation, his lawyers had filed a simultaneous secondary motion that struck me straight in the heart. The document claimed that I was suffering from severe, rapidly progressing, early-onset dementia. They used my age, my intense grief over my late wife, and my recent hyper-vigilant behavior as twisted proof that I was mentally unstable, delusional, and entirely unfit to provide a safe environment for my granddaughter. They argued that I had essentially kidnapped Lily from her rightful home under the influence of a paranoid conspiracy theory. Before I could even process the absolute horror of these accusations, a heavy, aggressive knock echoed through my front door. The sound rumbled through the quiet house, shattering the morning silence like a gunshot. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked to the hallway and looked through the peephole. 2 uniformed police officers were standing on my porch, their expressions stern and unyielding. Standing right behind them was Derek, flanked by his slick, expensive attorney. Derek looked entirely different from the panicked man I had envisioned. He stood tall in an expensive tailored suit, his face contorted into a perfect practiced mask of profound grief and righteous indignation. His lawyer held freshly stamped legal documents ready to wield them like a weapon. I opened the door, slowly, keeping my body positioned to block their view of the interior. The lead officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his holster. He informed me that they were there to execute an emergency court order. He explained that a judge had granted temporary custody of Lily back to her father, effective immediately pending a full evidentiary hearing regarding my mental competency. The words felt like physical blows knocking the air out of my lungs. Derek stepped forward, his voice dripping with a sickening manufactured sympathy that made my blood boil. He looked directly into my eyes, telling the officers he was deeply heartbroken by my cognitive decline, claiming he only wanted what was best for his daughter and for me. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. If I lost my temper, if I shouted or resisted, I would instantly validate every single lie written in their petition. I would prove to the police that I was indeed an unstable, aggressive old man suffering from dementia. I looked past Derek and saw the smug, triumphant smirk flashing across his eyes. He thought he had won. He had effectively cut off my legal legs, isolated Rachel, and brought the police to my doorstep to reclaim his leverage. Lily was upstairs, completely unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. I stood on the threshold, trapped in a vice of my enemy's creation, feeling the walls closing in from every single direction. The evidence I possessed was useless if I was locked in a psychiatric hold or stripped of my legal standing. I was completely cornered, staring into the eyes of a monster who had successfully turned the law against me. The uniform of the law was worn by men who had no idea they were serving a criminal master's desperate bid for absolute power. If I allowed them to take Lily, I knew I might never see her again, and Rachel would be left entirely unprotected in the dark. The trap had truly sprung, and I was completely caught inside. Before the lead officer could take another step toward my threshold, the sharp squeal of tires tearing up my gravel driveway shattered the tense silence. Mitchell had not just called me to deliver bad news. He had been speeding across town the entire time we spoke. He threw his luxury sedan into park on the front lawn, leaving the engine running and the driver's side door wide open as he sprinted up the concrete walkway. His usual calm, measured demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by the fierce intensity of a seasoned courtroom brawler who realized the rules of engagement had just been violently altered. Mitchell stepped firmly between the police officers and my front door, holding up a thick manila folder, like a physical shield against their authority. He did not ask questions. He immediately unleashed a relentless barrage of aggressive legal injunctions, his voice echoing loudly against the quiet morning stillness of the suburban neighborhood. He looked directly at Derek's high-priced attorney and informed him with absolute venom in his voice that the ex parte motion was fundamentally flawed, procedurally corrupt, and illegally executed under state law. Mitchell explained to the officers that they were being actively used as pawns in a fraudulent property and inheritance dispute, not responding to a legitimate child welfare crisis as they had been told. He pulled out pre-drafted counter motions he had apparently finalized on his laptop in the passenger seat during his frantic drive. He demanded that before any custody transfer or mental competency evaluation could be enforced, an entirely independent medical board chosen by a neutral third-party judge in a different jurisdiction must thoroughly review my health. He cited 3 different obscure state statutes regarding the sudden disruption of a minor's established living environment without a full, transparent evidentiary hearing on the public record. Derek's lawyer tried to aggressively object, his slick composure faltering, as Mitchell meticulously and loudly dismantled their fabricated timeline piece by piece. The police officers, caught completely off guard in the chaotic crossfire of 2 heavy-hitting attorneys, hesitated. They were patrolmen not equipped to mediate a high-level civil litigation dispute playing out on a civilian front porch. Mitchell capitalized on their sudden uncertainty with ruthless precision. He stated firmly that if they removed my granddaughter without allowing a standard 48-hour review period for a legal counterfiling, he would personally ensure the department faced a massive civil rights lawsuit for unlawful seizure and emotional distress. The bold bluff worked. The lead officer took a slow step back, conferring in hushed tones with his partner before declaring that they would not enforce the immediate extraction today. The judge on call would have to hear formal oral arguments first. Mitchell had miraculously stopped the clock. He had bought us precious time, but not much. He turned to me, his chest heaving slightly, and whispered that we had exactly 72 hours before a full hearing would be mandated by the court. 72 hours before Derek Sama could marshal his vast resources again and legally tear my family apart. Derek stared at me from the bottom of the porch steps, his manufactured mask of grief finally cracking to reveal pure, unadulterated hatred. He turned sharply on his heel and marched back to his car, leaving a heavy trail of poisonous fury in his wake. I pulled Mitchell inside, slamming the heavy wooden door and locking the brass deadbolt behind us. My hands were finally shaking, the overwhelming adrenaline of the confrontation slowly giving way to the terrifying, crushing reality of our ticking clock. Lily was still upstairs, sleeping soundly in her warm bed, completely oblivious to the vicious legal war being waged over her life just a few feet away. Mitchell spread his voluminous files across the granite kitchen island, his face grim and pale as he mapped out our defensive strategy for the upcoming hearing. But defense was simply no longer enough. We needed a definitive, undeniable killing blow. Just as I poured a desperate cup of bitter black coffee to steady my nerves, my cell phone vibrated sharply on the counter. It was Victor. I answered immediately, putting him on maximum speakerphone volume so Mitchell could hear every word. Victor did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He had spent the last 24 hours tearing through the dense encrypted data we had pulled from Derek's hidden offshore server. He had finally cracked the complex financial routing network Derek used to anonymously move stolen money around the globe. Victor explained, speaking rapidly, that he had tracked a highly obscured shell company, registered under a fake corporate entity, but tied directly back to Derek's primary home internet protocol address. 2 weeks ago, just as Rachel's condition had supposedly begun to rapidly deteriorate into psychosis, that specific shell company made a massive, untraceable cash purchase. They bought an abandoned, half-finished residential construction shell located deep in the East Side district. My blood ran completely cold at the mere mention of that specific location. The East Side district was an industrial dead zone for urban development, stalled by endless municipal zoning issues and left to rot for years. More importantly, it was the exact geographic area known throughout the county for its distinct, heavy red clay soil. The exact same rusty red clay I had found caked heavily on the tread of the tires of Derek's sport utility vehicle. Victor pulled up the municipal architectural blueprints and digitized property records, his voice crackling with excitement over the phone line. The property was massive, completely isolated from main roads, and surrounded by 12-foot-high privacy fencing left over from the bankrupt commercial developers. It was a concrete fortress hidden in plain sight, purchased anonymously by a man drowning in illegal debt who had absolutely no legitimate professional reason to buy abandoned commercial real estate. It was not a long-term investment. It was a secure holding cell. It was the exact place Derek was currently keeping whatever dark secrets he was desperate enough to kill for. The realization hit me hard. Rachel's sudden disappearance, the fabricated psychiatric hold, the rush for her trust fund, and this abandoned site. It was all connected. Victor immediately offered to call the police. He insisted we had enough circumstantial evidence to request a search warrant. I stared blankly at the documents scattered across the island, thinking of the officers who had just stood on my porch, ready to arrest me. I refused his offer outright. I explained that the police still viewed Derek as the victim of a dangerous wife. If they spooked him without solid proof of a crime, Derek would instantly use the warning to destroy whatever evidence was hidden inside before tactical teams could breach those gates. We could not rely on a system he manipulated so easily. I ordered Victor to stand by and track the servers. He warned me that a cornered man in debt to a violent syndicate would resort to lethal force. I knew the extreme danger, but I walked to the hall closet and grabbed my heavy steel lockbox. I told Victor I was going in entirely alone. I parked my old Ford truck deep in the shadows of an overgrown access road a mile away from the coordinates Victor had provided. I sat in the total darkness for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. I grabbed my canvas tool bag from the passenger seat, the same one I had carried onto hundreds of commercial job sites over 4 decades. I slung the strap over my shoulder, grabbed my heavy steel crowbar, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The hike toward the abandoned subdivision was brutal on my 70-year-old knees. The terrain was entirely unpaved, covered in thick mud that clung to my heavy work boots. I looked down. The earth here was a deep, rusty red. It was the exact same heavy clay caked into the treads of Derek's shoes. The final piece of geographical evidence was right beneath my feet. I pressed forward, navigating through the overgrown weeds until the massive skeletal frame of the residential shell loomed out of the darkness. It was an enormous concrete and wood structure surrounded by towering chain-link fences. I slipped quietly through a wide gap in the plastic privacy sheeting that flapped loudly in the cold wind. I stepped onto the main level. I switched on my high-beam tactical flashlight and swept the bright circle of light across the cavernous, unfinished room. Dust particles danced in the beam. Exposed wooden studs cast long, jagged shadows against the bare concrete foundation walls. It looked like a typical bankrupt development project completely forgotten by the world. But I did not just look around like a frightened civilian. I looked at the space with the critical, unforgiving eye of a master commercial construction inspector. I walked slowly across the main floor, my boots crunching softly against the scattered gravel. I found a discarded wooden folding table in the corner covered in empty water bottles and a faded set of architectural blueprints. I unrolled the thick blue paper, shining my light over the technical dimensions. My eyes scanned the original structural footprint. I committed the numbers to memory and stepped back. I began to pace the length of the ground floor. I counted my steps, measuring the distance between the primary load-bearing beams and the exterior stakes. I walked from the front foyer to the back utility room, calculating the square footage of the poured concrete slab. I turned around and paced the width of the structure, cross-referencing the distance against the numbers on the blueprint. I stopped dead in the middle of the room. The geometry was entirely wrong. I paced the area a second time to be absolutely certain. The numbers did not lie. The physical space on the main floor was exactly 150 square feet smaller than the poured concrete footprint detailed in the official blueprints. There was a massive structural void hidden somewhere inside this house. Someone had intentionally altered the interior framing to conceal a massive amount of empty space. I tightened my grip on the heavy steel crowbar. I moved slowly toward the back utility room, dragging the solid metal tip of the crowbar firmly across the wooden subflooring. I listened intently to the sound of the metal scraping against the wood. It produced a dull, solid thud with every strike. I moved systematically, stepping carefully over exposed pipes and electrical conduits, striking the floor every 2 feet. Solid thud, solid thud, solid thud. I reached the far corner of the utility room, an area cleverly obscured by a stack of discarded drywall sheets. I pushed the heavy drywall out of the way, my muscles aching with the intense physical strain. I struck the floor beneath the pile. The sound shifted instantly. It was no longer a dull, heavy thud. It was a sharp, hollow echo. I dropped to my knees and aimed my flashlight directly at the floorboards. The area was meticulously covered with several large, freshly installed cement backer boards, the kind contractors lay down right before installing heavy ceramic tile. They were screwed tightly into the subfloor, perfectly flush and highly professional. To an ordinary person, it just looked like a prepped bathroom floor. But I knew that cement backer board was never installed in a utility closet unless there was something vital beneath it that needed heavy protection from discovery. I jammed the wedged end of my steel crowbar deep under the tight seam of the first cement board. I threw my entire body weight backward, using the heavy metal bar as a powerful lever. The thick screws groaned loudly, tearing through the wood in a shower of dust and splinters. I ripped the heavy board up and tossed it violently to the side. I moved to the next board, jamming the crowbar into the gap, pulling backward with every ounce of strength I had left. My chest was heaving, my breath turning to white mist in the freezing air. I ripped the second board away, and the terrible truth was finally exposed. There, perfectly recessed into the subfloor, was a heavy reinforced steel trapdoor. It was not a cheap basement hatch. It was a professional industrial-grade security door, secured firmly by a digital electronic keypad built directly into the thick steel frame. Derek had used the massive amount of stolen money to build an impenetrable subterranean fortress. I stared at the blinking red light of the keypad. I did not have the access code. I dropped the crowbar and quickly unzipped my canvas tool bag. I reached inside and pulled out a battery-powered angle grinder. It was a high-torque power tool designed to cut through thick commercial rebar and heavy iron pipes. I attached a fresh diamond-tipped cutting wheel and slapped on my protective safety goggles. I knelt beside the steel trapdoor, positioned the grinding wheel directly over the thick, heavy-duty steel hinges, and squeezed the trigger. The tool roared to life, with a deafening scream. I drove the spinning diamond blade hard into the solid metal hinge. A shower of bright orange sparks erupted into the dark room. I leaned my full weight into the grinder, forcing the blade through the heavy metal bracket. The tool bucked violently, but I held it steady. The first hinge gave way with a loud snap. I moved to the second hinge, pressing the blade into the steel. Sparks showered over my jacket, but I only felt the desperate need to reach my daughter. With a sharp crack, the second hinge sheared off. I tossed the grinder aside and pulled the steel handle upward. The heavy door lifted free, screeching against the concrete. As I pulled it open, a blast of cold air hit my face like a physical blow. The smell was horrific, a sickening mixture of harsh industrial antiseptics and trapped human sweat. I picked up my flashlight and pointed it directly down into the gaping hole. The bright beam revealed a narrow flight of concrete stairs leading deep underground. I took a deep, shaky breath and descended into the pitch-black darkness. My boots echoed loudly against the cold, hard stone steps. The air grew thicker with every step down into the depths of the abandoned construction site. The scent of industrial disinfectants mixed with the sour odor of human captivity. It was a chemical stench that made my stomach churn. I swept my tactical flashlight across the damp concrete walls as I reached the bottom of the narrow stairwell. The space before me was isolated from the world above. Heavy acoustic paneling covered every inch of the cinder block walls installed to absorb any sound. This was a soundproofed medical cell designed for absolute horror. I moved the light toward the center of the freezing room. My breath caught in my throat. My entire body went numb, paralyzed by the magnitude of the nightmare unfolding in front of my eyes. There she was, my beautiful daughter. Rachel was lying flat on a narrow medical cot, illuminated only by the harsh glare of a battery-powered work lamp hanging from a ceiling joist. I rushed to her side, dropping to my knees against the freezing concrete floor. I called out her name, my voice breaking into a desperate whisper that echoed off the soundproof panels. She did not answer. Rachel was alive, but barely clinging to the edge of survival. Her face was pale, her cheekbones sharp against her emaciated skin. She looked like a fragile ghost of the vibrant woman I had raised. Her wrists and ankles were secured tightly to the thick steel frame of the medical cot, with leather restraints reinforced by steel chains. The leather had rubbed her pale skin raw. I reached out with a trembling hand and brushed the sweat-soaked hair away from her cold forehead. Her skin was dangerously clammy. I looked down at her fragile arm. A plastic intravenous line was securely taped to the delicate inside of her elbow. The medical tube snaked upward, connecting directly to a sterile liquid drip bag suspended from a metal pole beside the cold bed. A steady rhythm of clear liquid was dripping down the plastic chamber, pumping relentlessly into her veins. I grabbed the plastic bag with shaking fingers and shined my flashlight closely on the medical label. It was a restricted chemical sedative. It was a powerful psychotropic drug designed to subdue aggressive psychiatric patients. The truth of Derek's master plan slammed into my mind with the force of a runaway freight train. He was not trying to murder Rachel. A dead wife would trigger a massive police homicide investigation, and her entire $5 million trust fund would default to Lily locked away in probate court. Derek desperately needed Rachel alive. He needed her breathing and physically present. But he needed her destroyed from the inside out. He had dragged her down into this dark concrete tomb to chemically induce a state of irreversible psychosis. He was pumping her delicate system full of heavy sedatives and mind-altering chemicals every hour of the day. He intended to keep her chained down here in the dark, systematically destroying her cognitive functions day by day. When the powerful drugs had done their permanent damage, when her beautiful brain was shattered, he would stage a miraculous rescue. He would play the desperate husband who bravely found his mentally ill wife locked in an abandoned building. And when the medical doctors examined her in a hospital, they would find a woman detached from reality, unable to speak or reason. They would have no choice but to legally declare her insane. Derek would walk into a courtroom with a tearful face, holding his traumatized daughter's hand for the cameras. The sympathetic judge would grant him immediate total legal conservatorship over Rachel and her financial estate. He would gain unrestricted access to her $5 million trust fund, allowing him to quietly pay off his gambling debts to the dangerous offshore criminal syndicate. He was destroying her beautiful mind just to save his own pathetic life. A wave of pure, blinding rage surged through my chest. It was a visceral, consuming anger unlike anything I had ever felt in my entire 70 years on this earth. My vision narrowed to a sharp point. My hands clenched into tight fists, my fingernails digging painfully into my palms. I wanted to tear Derek apart with my bare hands. I wanted to inflict every ounce of pain and terror he had caused my innocent daughter. The polite, grieving father was dead. I was a fierce protector standing over my injured child, and I was prepared to burn his entire world to the ground to ensure he never drew another peaceful breath. I forced the rage aside, forcing my mind to focus entirely on the tactical objective. I had to get Rachel out of those restraints immediately. I reached deeply into my canvas tool bag and pulled out a heavy pair of industrial bolt cutters. The steel jaws were designed to snap commercial padlocks and sever security chain links. I positioned the metal cutters around the steel chain binding Rachel's left wrist. I gripped the rubberized handles tightly, preparing to squeeze with every ounce of physical strength I possessed in my old bones. I leaned down and whispered to Rachel to hold on, promising her with determination that we were finally going home. But right before I could apply the physical pressure, right before I could successfully snap the heavy steel link, a jarring sound shattered the dead silence of the underground medical cell. It was the loud, unmistakable crunch of heavy vehicle tires rolling aggressively over the loose exterior gravel. The sound came directly from the ground level right above my head. The high, narrow basement security window located near the very top of the cinder block wall suddenly flared with a sweeping light. The piercing high-beam headlights of an approaching vehicle cut forcefully through the darkness of the ruined commercial subdivision, casting long shadows straight across the ceiling of the concrete cell. Someone arrived at the abandoned property. The heavy vehicle engine rumbled loudly, vibrating aggressively through the thick, cold concrete walls of the hidden basement. The powerful engine cut off abruptly, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. The metallic thud of car doors slamming shut echoed sharply through the freezing night air above the structure. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, aggressive footsteps were moving quickly across the loose gravel, heading straight toward the ripped plastic sheeting of the main floor entrance. My heart hammered a frantic, absolutely desperate rhythm against my aching ribs. I was trapped deep underground with my unconscious, defenseless daughter, armed with nothing but a pair of heavy bolt cutters and a solid steel crowbar. I slowly lowered the heavy tool, my mind racing through a million possible tactical survival scenarios in a very single fraction of a second. I reached up and quickly switched off the harsh battery-powered work lamp, instantly plunging the cold concrete medical cell back into near-total, suffocating darkness. I stood perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe, listening intently to the heavy boots walking purposefully across the old wooden subfloor, directly above my head. The tense, quiet game of shadows was finally over tonight. The monster had officially returned to his hidden cage. I stood perfectly still in the suffocating darkness of the underground medical cell. The harsh concrete floor radiated a freezing chill right through the thick soles of my heavy work boots, but the cold sweat gathering on the back of my neck was born entirely of pure, unfiltered adrenaline. Directly above my head, the heavy, deliberate footsteps moved across the exposed wooden subflooring. The sound vibrated down through the ceiling joists, dropping a heavy weight of dread squarely into the pit of my stomach. They were pacing back and forth near the utility room, right where I had just ripped open the secret trapdoor. I strained my ears, listening intently to the muffled sounds filtering down through the heavy air. I realized very quickly that there was more than one set of boots walking across that floor. Two distinct sets of footsteps pounded against the wood. Then the voices began. The primary voice was undeniably Derek. It carried that familiar arrogant cadence, a sharp, demanding tone that cut through the silence like a knife. But he was actively arguing with another man. The second voice was higher-pitched, nervous, and audibly shaking with anxiety. I pressed my back flat against the cold cinder block wall, closing my eyes to focus entirely on deciphering their muffled argument. Derek was barking orders, telling the other man to stop panicking and just do exactly what he was paid a massive fortune to do. The nervous man protested, his voice cracking, as he complained about the extreme legal risks of being brought to an abandoned commercial construction site in the absolute dead of night. He stammered about his state license, about the severe felony charges of participating in a fraudulent medical kidnapping. The puzzle pieces locked together instantly in my analytical mind. The second man was a corrupt notary public. Derek had dragged a desperate, bribed official down to this dark, isolated hellhole for one very specific, terrifying purpose. He needed an official state seal to validate the emergency power of attorney documents tonight. He brought the notary here to physically press my unconscious daughter's ink-stained thumb against the heavy legal paperwork, forging her official consent, while she remained strapped to a steel cot, entirely lost in a chemically induced coma. The sheer audacity of his evil plan took my breath away. I slowly opened my eyes, letting them adjust to the absolute pitch-black darkness of the underground ward. I looked down at my own hands. My knuckles were pale, gripping the heavy steel crowbar with a fierce, desperate intensity. But as the adrenaline began to level out, the harsh, unforgiving reality of my physical situation settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. I am a 70-year-old man. I have spent 4 decades inspecting commercial construction sites, climbing steel scaffolding, and walking concrete foundations. I am tough, and I possess a deep, resilient strength forged by years of hard physical labor. But I am not a young soldier, and I am certainly not an action hero from a movie. My knees ache when the temperature drops. My lower back burns after a long day of standing. I was currently trapped in a confined subterranean concrete box with a single narrow exit blocked entirely by the enemy. Standing right above me were 2 young, desperate, highly motivated men. Derek was 35 years old, tall, heavily built, and currently fueled by the absolute terror of a $3 million debt owed to a violent offshore gambling syndicate. If I marched straight up those narrow concrete stairs and tried to fight them head-on with nothing but a rusted steel crowbar, the mathematical probability of my survival was practically 0. They would easily overpower me in a matter of seconds. Derek would not hesitate to kill me. He would see it as a necessary, completely justified act of survival. He would bludgeon me to death, dump my body in an unmarked grave deep in the surrounding woods, and proceed with his plan to completely destroy Rachel. If I died down here on this cold floor tonight, Rachel would be permanently lost to the system, and my innocent granddaughter Lily would be left entirely alone, raised by the very monster who had orchestrated the destruction of her entire family. A direct physical confrontation was a guaranteed suicide mission. Brute force would only ensure our mutual destruction. I had to discard my anger. I had to let go of the burning paternal rage that demanded I charge up those stairs and break his jaw. I needed to think like a master inspector. The heavy footsteps above stopped abruptly. The muffled arguing ceased. The unmistakable metallic squeal of the heavy steel hinges echoed down the stairwell. Derek was currently pulling the heavy security trapdoor all the way open. A faint, dusty beam of ambient moonlight filtered down from the main floor, barely illuminating the jagged edges of the concrete steps. I had absolutely no time left. I mentally calculated the distance. I had less than 30 seconds before they navigated the steep descent and stepped foot into the soundproofed medical cell. 30 seconds to formulate a flawless, tactical defense. I breathed in slowly through my nose, forcing my racing heartbeat into a steady, controlled rhythm. I had to rely on my intellect, my deep understanding of environmental geometry, and my most potent weapon against a malignant narcissist, his own blinding arrogance. Derek genuinely believed that he was the smartest person in any room. He believed that everyone around him was a gullible, easily manipulated pawn, He thought I was nothing more than a clueless, grieving old man who had completely swallowed his tragic narrative earlier that morning on his parents' front porch. I needed to use his massive ego as the very instrument of his own downfall. I needed to construct a psychological and physical trap that he would gladly walk right into without a second thought. I rapidly scanned the dark freezing room, letting my eyes trace the faint outlines of the commercial equipment scattered around the perimeter. I noted the heavy industrial water boiler sitting dormant in the far back corner. I saw the thick fiberglass insulation rolls piled high against the damp cinder block wall. I identified the primary electrical conduit panel and the heavy cast iron water main valve protruding from the concrete directly near the base of the stairwell. Every single object in this underground cell was a potential tool. My mind mapped out the precise spatial dynamics of the room, calculating trajectories, sight lines, and choke points. I was not going to fight Derek with my muscles. I was going to fight him with the environment itself. I was going to turn his hidden subterranean fortress into a meticulously designed cage. The heavy, deliberate thud of a leather boot struck the very first concrete step at the top of the stairwell. Derek was beginning his descent into the darkness. The nervous notary followed closely behind him, his footsteps shuffling and hesitant. I moved with a sudden, silent urgency, my heavy work boots gliding soundlessly across the smooth concrete floor. I was fully ready to face him. I held my breath. The heavy steel trapdoor slammed fully open against the concrete floor above, and the brilliant, blinding beam of a heavy-duty tactical flashlight sliced violently through the suffocating darkness of the underground ward. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, letting my pupils adjust to the sudden harsh glare as the two men began their descent. The heavy rhythmic thud of Derek's leather boots echoed off the cinder block walls, accompanied by the frantic slipping footsteps of the notary trailing nervously close behind him. I pressed my spine flush against the freezing concrete wall, hidden entirely within the deep shadow cast by the massive industrial water boiler. My chest rose and fell in slow, completely silent breaths. I listened to the shifting beam of the flashlight sweep across the room. The light hit the center of the floor. It hit the narrow medical cot. It hit the severed plastic intravenous line dangling uselessly from the metal pole, dripping clear liquid into a small, dark puddle on the stone floor. Derek stopped dead at the bottom of the stairs. The absolute silence in the room was shattered by his sudden, explosive gasp. He let out a vicious, guttural curse that reverberated off the acoustic paneling. The beam of his flashlight darted wildly around the empty cell, illuminating the torn leather restraints and the empty space where his wife was supposed to be chemically chained. The notary practically collided with Derek's back, letting out a sharp squeal of pure panic. The smaller man stammered, his voice climbing to a terrified pitch, asking Derek where the woman was, asking what kind of illegal operation he had been dragged into, and threatening to run straight back up the stairs. Derek was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with sheer panic. He spun in a tight circle, the flashlight beam cutting wildly across the empty corners of the room. He genuinely thought Rachel had somehow broken her bonds and escaped, or worse, that someone else had found his hidden fortress. His carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. This was my exact cue. It was the precise moment to deploy the illusion. I let the heavy steel crowbar slip from my right hand. It hit the concrete floor with a loud, ringing metallic clang that sounded like a gunshot in the confined space. Derek whipped around instantly, aiming the blinding center of his flashlight directly at the sound. The beam hit me squarely in the chest. I did not raise my hands to shield my eyes. I did not stand tall or brace for an impact. I instantly collapsed my posture, letting my shoulders slump forward and my knees buckle slightly. I widened my eyes in feigned absolute terror and let a violent, uncontrollable tremor overtake my hands. I squinted into the glaring light, blinking rapidly, playing the exact role his malicious legal documents had written for me. I stumbled forward into the light, dragging my heavy boots across the concrete, like a man entirely lost in a thick mental fog. I raised one shaking hand toward him. I let my voice waver, pitching it high and reedy, filling it with the pathetic confusion of a mind slipping into profound dementia. "Derek." Is that you? I coughed weakly, looking around the cold, harsh room with vacant, frightened eyes. Why is it so dark down here? Are we at the hospital? I cannot remember how I got here, Derek. Where is Rachel? I think I forgot to take my morning medication. I cannot find my pills. Derek stood completely frozen, the heavy flashlight shaking slightly in his grip as he stared at my pathetic display. For 5 agonizing seconds, the absolute silence in the underground cell was deafening. He processed the wrinkled shirt, the stooped posture, the shaking hands, and the utterly vacant expression on my face. He mentally connected the dots. He genuinely believed that his fabricated legal narrative had somehow manifested into reality. He thought I was a broken, senile old man who had simply wandered out of his house in a confused daze, tracked his vehicle, and stumbled blindly into the wrong building, without any comprehension of where I was or what I was seeing. The sheer panic on Derek's face melted away. It was replaced instantly by a long, deep exhale of profound relief. He lowered the flashlight slightly, ensuring the beam still illuminated my frail posture. And then he began to laugh. It started as a low, breathless chuckle, but it quickly escalated into a vicious, cruel, mocking laugh that echoed terribly off the cold walls. He threw his head back, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his chest shaking with dark amusement. He turned his head to look at the terrified notary, who was still cowering near the bottom step, completely paralyzed by the bizarre scene unfolding before him. Derek pointed a finger right at my chest, his voice dripping with absolute venom and unchecked arrogance. He told the notary to look at me. He gloated loudly, his words filled with a sickening superiority. He told the terrified official that this pathetic, wandering old fool was the great Harrison Caldwell. He mocked my career, my life, and my desperate attempt to save my family. He stood tall, puffing out his chest, utterly intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. He believed he was completely untouchable. I took another clumsy step forward, keeping my hands shaking near my chest, my face twisted in a mask of total confusion. I begged him to take me home. I whined that I was cold and that I just wanted to see my daughter. My pathetic pleading acted like pouring premium gasoline onto a raging fire. Derek could not resist the overwhelming urge to completely dominate a man he believed was mentally broken. The narcissism burned so brightly inside him that he had to take a victory lap. He had to explain his sheer genius to his captive audience. He stepped directly into my personal space, looking down at me with an expression of pure, concentrated evil. Loudly and clearly, Derek began to confess to every single atrocity he had committed. He wanted the notary to understand exactly who was in charge, and he wanted to break whatever fragile pieces of my mind he thought were still functioning. He leaned in close, the smell of his expensive cologne mixing with the stale air of the cell. He laughed right in my face and told me that Rachel was not at a hospital. He proudly announced that she was not crazy at all. He gleefully explained how he had systematically poisoned my daughter's mind. He bragged about logging onto the dark web, bypassing international pharmacies, to purchase high-grade restricted psychotropic sedatives and powerful hallucinogens. He detailed how he had secretly crushed those pills and slipped them into her morning coffee and her evening meals for weeks, watching with absolute delight as her brilliant mind slowly fractured and unraveled under the heavy chemical weight. He turned back to the notary, projecting his voice loudly, boasting about the sheer perfection of his forged psychiatric files. He named the corrupt, unlicensed medical practitioner he had paid off with stolen cash to stamp the official diagnostic papers. He gloated about how easily the family court judge had swallowed the fabricated story of postpartum psychosis. He laid out the timeline of his master plan with terrifying precision, leaving absolutely no detail to the imagination. I kept my head bowed, forcing tears of confusion to spill over my eyelids, sobbing quietly as he continued to completely dismantle his own alibi. He stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, his voice echoing loudly in the small room. He looked at me and coldly explained what he had done to my beautiful, innocent granddaughter. He admitted with a sickening smirk that Lily was not traumatized by her mother. He said he had to physically lock the screaming 7-year-old child inside that dark walk-in closet fastening a heavy padlock to the door so she would not run out, and see him violently dragging Rachel's unconscious body down the stairs and into the back of his vehicle. He laughed as he described leaving her alone in the dark, with nothing but a few juice boxes, while he executed his flawless extraction. And then the final devastating piece of the puzzle fell directly from his own mouth. Derek raised his arms, gesturing to the cold concrete walls around us. He proudly declared that he had purchased this abandoned commercial shell through an untraceable offshore holding company. He confessed everything about the massive, suffocating debt. He stated clearly, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, that he owed $3 million to a violent offshore sports betting syndicate. He detailed his plan to legally seize Rachel's $5 million trust fund through the emergency conservatorship, intending to completely liquidate her assets, pay off his lethal gambling markers, and leave my daughter rotting in an institution for the rest of her natural life. He stood there in the freezing dark, smiling like a triumphant king who had just conquered the entire world. He had laid out every single motive, every illegal action, and every malicious intent in pristine, unadulterated detail. I kept my hands shaking against my chest. I kept my eyes wide and vacant. I played the broken, senile grandfather to the absolute bitter end. But beneath my thick canvas jacket, hidden securely in the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, the red recording light of my cell phone pulsed steadily in the darkness. My voice recorder app was running flawlessly. It was quietly drinking in the sound waves, capturing every single arrogant syllable, every cruel laugh, and every damning confession. Derek had just handed me his own heavily secured digital execution. The trap had slammed shut with a resounding, invisible finality, and the monster had absolutely no idea he was already completely dead. The echo of Derek's sickening confession was still ringing in the cold, damp air of the underground medical cell when the sheer magnitude of the situation finally pierced the notary's paralyzing shock. The small, nervous man stared wide-eyed at the empty medical cot, then down at the severed plastic intravenous line dripping clear chemical fluid onto the rough concrete, and finally at Derek. The notary suddenly realized that he had just become an active accessory to a violent, premeditated medical kidnapping, extensive wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. He let out a sharp, choked sound from the back of his throat. Without uttering a single word of protest or asking for permission, the notary turned sharply on his heel. He scrambled frantically toward the narrow concrete stairwell. He was bolting in sheer terror, entirely consumed by the desperate need to escape. I listened as his panicked footsteps pounded heavily across the subflooring above us, followed seconds later by the distant, frantic crunch of gravel outside. Derek did not flinch when the man ran away. He simply did not care. His colossal arrogance had convinced him that a terrified, cowardly bureaucrat would never dare go to the police and implicate himself in such a massive, highly illegal conspiracy. Derek slowly turned his full, undivided attention back to me. The cruel, mocking smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by an expression of cold, calculated malice. He reached his right hand deep into the interior breast pocket of his expensive, tailored jacket. When his hand emerged, his fingers were wrapped tightly around the barrel of a thick medical syringe. The needle was long and menacing, catching the faint reflection of the flashlight beam. The plastic barrel was completely filled with a perfectly clear, viscous liquid. It was a concentrated lethal dose of the same heavy psychotropic sedative he had been pumping relentlessly into my daughter's veins. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, closing the physical distance between us. He looked down at me, his eyes dead and unfeeling. He spoke with a chilling, absolute calmness that completely betrayed the monstrous nature of his intentions. He told me that I had just saved him a massive amount of incredibly tedious legal paperwork. He let out a soft, breathy sigh, shaking his head with a mock display of manufactured sorrow. He said it was such a tragic, unfortunate event. A confused, wandering old man suffering from severe advanced Alzheimer's disease tragically loses his way in the dark, wanders blindly onto an abandoned commercial construction site, and suddenly dies of a massive spontaneous heart attack, brought on by the extreme physical stress. It was the perfect airtight conclusion to his flawless illusion. He raised the syringe, positioning his thumb over the plunger, preparing to inject the lethal chemical. Derek lunged forward. He thrust his arm out with a sudden, violent burst of speed, driving the sharp needle straight toward my collarbone. He fully expected me to cower. He expected me to freeze in absolute terror, entirely paralyzed by the frail, senile confusion I had been projecting for the past 20 minutes. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten who he was dealing with. In a fraction of a single second, the pathetic, confused old man vanished entirely from my eyes. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. The deliberate slump in my shoulders disappeared as I straightened my spine, pulling myself up to my full physical height. The transition was so abrupt, so completely absolute, that I saw a flash of genuine, unadulterated confusion cross Derek's face just as he committed his body weight to the forward thrust. I did not possess the speed of youth, but I possessed something far more dangerous. I possessed 4 decades of deeply ingrained, highly honed job site reflexes. I had spent my entire adult life navigating incredibly dangerous commercial construction zones, constantly dodging falling steel debris, swinging cranes, and sudden environmental hazards. My body knew exactly how to react to imminent physical danger without requiring a single conscious thought. As the deadly needle closed the distance to my chest, I executed a sharp, precise pivot. I planted my left work boot firmly against the rough concrete floor and twisted my torso sharply to the outside, completely sidestepping his aggressive forward momentum. Derek stumbled slightly, his balance suddenly compromised as the syringe stabbed violently through empty air, brushing harmlessly past the heavy canvas fabric of my outer jacket. Before he could pull his arm back to attempt a second strike, I moved with brutal, unforgiving precision. I brought my right hand up like a heavy steel vise, my thick, calloused fingers wrapping violently around his exposed wrist. I gripped the joint with every single ounce of crushing strength I had cultivated over 40 years of gripping heavy iron scaffolding and torquing commercial wrenches. Derek let out a shocked, breathless gasp as my fingers dug painfully into the delicate tendons of his wrist. I did not give him a single moment to recover his footing. I planted my feet, utilizing my lower body leverage, and yanked his arm forcefully downward and across my chest. I used his own forward off-balance momentum entirely against him. I violently twisted his wrist and shoved his extended arm completely sideways, driving his hand brutally against the solid, unforgiving edge of the massive concrete pillar standing directly beside us. The physical impact was sickeningly loud. The thick plastic barrel of the medical syringe completely shattered against the hard stone surface. The sharp metallic needle snapped instantly, clattering uselessly to the floor. The clear, lethal liquid burst from the fractured plastic, splashing harmlessly against the gray cinder block wall and dripping down onto the dusty concrete. Derek let out a piercing, agonizing howl of pure rage and sudden physical pain. The bone-rattling impact against the pillar had severely bruised his arm and temporarily paralyzed the nerves in his hand. He stumbled backward, clutching his injured wrist against his chest, his face contorted in a mask of absolute shock and furious disbelief. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his mind violently struggling to process the impossible reality that the frail, dying man he had intended to murder was currently standing before him with the cold, immovable posture of a seasoned predator. The illusion was completely dead. I stood tall in the darkness of the underground cell, my jaw set, my eyes locked onto his every movement. Derek realized instantly that he was no longer dealing with an easy victim. He reached down to the heavy leather tool belt strapped around his waist. His uninjured hand closed tightly around the solid textured grip of a massive heavy steel plumbing wrench. He ripped the heavy iron tool free, raising it high above his shoulder like a primitive club. The heavy metal gleamed menacingly in the ambient light filtering down from the stairwell. He was younger, and he was undeniably faster. As Derek took a heavy, threatening step forward, swinging the wrench aggressively, I immediately initiated a slow, highly strategic retreat. I moved backward with extreme calculated precision, flawlessly guiding him directly backwards toward the basement's massive main commercial water intake valve. The damp air between us suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Derek did not just walk toward me. He stalked forward like a wounded, cornered predator. The heavy steel plumbing wrench swung loosely at his side, the iron head occasionally scraping against the rough cinder block wall and sending a harsh metallic screech echoing through the dark medical cell. His breathing was loud and ragged. The polished, charming son-in-law was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, violent man who realized his perfectly orchestrated plan was unraveling by the second. He glared at me with absolute murder in his eyes. He raised the heavy wrench, pointing it directly at my face, and began to speak with a terrifying forced calmness. He told me that I had ruined everything. He said he had worked too hard to build his life to maintain his elite image, and he was not going to let a stubborn old man take it all away. He took a heavy step forward, his boots crunching loudly on the dusty concrete floor. I did not answer him immediately. I took another slow, deliberate step backward. My heavy work boots slid carefully over the smooth surface. I was not just backing away randomly. I was letting my feet feel the slight, almost imperceptible downward slope of the basement floor. In commercial construction, every foundation is poured with a specific grade to direct water flow toward the primary drainage systems. I knew exactly where the lowest point of this room was, and I needed Derek to step directly into the center of that specific zone. I kept my eyes locked onto his, feigning a look of sheer exhaustion. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction more, making myself look like a man who had finally run out of options and out of time. Derek took the bait completely. He closed the distance, his confidence surging back as he saw me retreat. He began to loudly justify his horrific actions, screaming over the faint humming of the electrical panel. He yelled that Rachel never truly appreciated the massive wealth she had. He claimed she selfishly hoarded her $5 million trust fund, while he was drowning in suffocating debt, trying to provide the luxury lifestyle she expected. He said the offshore gambling syndicate was going to kill him in 2 weeks, and he believed he had every legal and moral right to take her money to save his own life. He spat out the words, his face contorted with a sickening sense of pure entitlement. He genuinely believed that he was the actual victim in this dark, concrete room. He told me that after he finished dealing with me, he was going to turn the powerful sedative drip back on and finish the job he started on my beautiful daughter. The casual mention of Rachel sent a fresh, blinding wave of cold fury rushing through my veins, but I brutally forced it down into the deepest part of my mind. Uncontrolled anger makes you careless, and I simply could not afford a single mistake tonight. I took one final calculated step backward. The heavy rubber heel of my right boot finally tapped gently against the thick, heavily rusted cast iron collar of the high-pressure water main protruding from the base of the wall. I had reached the exact necessary destination. I stopped retreating and planted my feet shoulder-width apart, securing my physical balance on the cold floor. I looked directly at Derek. He was standing exactly 3 feet away from me, perfectly positioned in the lowest drainage basin of the concrete floor. His eyes were wide with a manic, dangerous energy. He gripped the textured handle of the heavy iron wrench with both hands and slowly raised it high above his right shoulder, fully intending to bring it down hard on my unprotected skull. He smiled at me, a cold, entirely empty expression that promised absolute, uncompromising violence in the dark. He took a deep breath, shifting his weight forward, and quietly told me to say goodbye to my daughter forever. He tightened his grip on the weapon and prepared to violently swing it down toward my head without hesitation. I kept my eyes locked on the wrench gripped tightly in his uninjured hand. Derek let out a scream, swinging the massive tool in a wide arc. I shuffled backward, my boots sliding deliberately across the dusty concrete. I needed him to believe I was retreating out of sheer panic, that the burst of adrenaline was already fading from my bones. I stumbled on purpose, letting my shoulders drop, drawing him deeper into the corner of the room. He took the bait completely. He charged forward, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred, convinced he was about to land the final blow. He raised the wrench high above his head, focused on crushing my skull. He did not look down at the floor. He did not look at the rusted iron collar protruding from the concrete wall behind me. It was the primary water intake valve for the unfinished subdivision. It was a massive pipe designed to supply thousands of gallons of water per minute to a sprawling development, and it had been rusting in the basement for years. I stopped retreating and planted my feet shoulder-width apart. Derek brought the wrench down with a vicious sweeping motion. I dropped my center of gravity in a fraction of a second, bending my knees and ducking sharply beneath the arc of the swinging weapon. The heavy iron sailed harmlessly over my head, cutting through the empty air with a sharp whistling sound. As I dropped, my right hand reached out and closed firmly around the cold grip of the steel crowbar I had intentionally dropped to the floor moments ago. I did not attempt to strike Derek. Striking him would only result in a physical struggle I could not sustain. Instead, I gripped the crowbar with both hands, pivoted sharply on my heel, and swung the steel bar with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. I aimed directly for the weakest structural point in the dark room. I swung the crowbar squarely at the rusted iron collar of the massive water main. The solid steel collided with the oxidized iron collar with a deafening crack that echoed violently through the underground cell. The brittle metal shattered instantly upon impact, failing to contain the immense hydraulic pressure trapped behind it. The pipe completely snapped. For a split second, there was absolute silence, and then the basement erupted. A blinding, deafening geyser of freezing high-pressure water exploded from the severed pipe with the kinetic force of a detonating bomb. The sheer volume of water rushing out of the commercial main was staggering. It was not a leak. It was a solid column of pressurized water blasting outward at hundreds of pounds per square inch. The massive jet of freezing water caught Derek squarely in the center of his chest before he could register the sound of the breaking pipe. The impact lifted his 200-pound frame completely off his feet. He was thrown backward through the air like a discarded ragdoll, powerless against the overwhelming hydraulic force. He flew backward and slammed brutally into the opposite cinder block wall. The sickening thud of his body hitting the stone was drowned out by the thunderous roar of the erupting geyser. The heavy wrench flew from his grip, clattering loudly against the far corner of the room. Derek collapsed onto the concrete floor, entirely submerged in the rising flood, gasping for oxygen that his bruised lungs could not draw in. The freezing water was instantly filling the medical cell, swirling violently around my boots and rising past my ankles in seconds. The sheer noise of the rushing water was deafening, echoing off the concrete walls and the low ceiling. The room was transforming into a chaotic whirlpool. I grabbed the steel frame of Rachel's medical cot, bracing my legs against the immense pull of the surging water to ensure her bed remained stable and upright. I looked across the room. Derek was struggling violently on his hands and knees, fighting against the blinding spray and the freezing current. He was disoriented, blinded by the pressurized water blasting continuously against the back of his head. He tried to crawl forward, his hands slipping uselessly against the smooth concrete. His expensive suit was ruined, soaked through and clinging to his battered frame. The arrogant mastermind had been reduced to a crawling animal, drowning in his subterranean cage. He coughed violently, spitting up freezing water as he tried to drag himself toward the narrow concrete stairwell. He knew his elaborate plan was completely destroyed, and his only instinct now was pure, selfish survival. He reached a shaking hand toward the bottom step, fully intending to abandon my daughter and leave us both to drown in the dark. But his escape was violently cut short. Just as Derek's fingers brushed the edge of the first concrete stair, the heavy wooden doors at the top of the stairwell were blown entirely out of their frames. A massive thunderous crash shook the ceiling joists above, completely overpowering the roaring sound of the broken water main. The thick wooden panels splintered into 1,000 pieces as they were kicked off their hinges by uncompromising physical force. An array of tactical flashlights cut downward through the dark, swirling mist of the water spray, like focused laser beams. The synchronized pounding of armored boots echoed loudly down the narrow concrete stairwell. The cavalry had arrived. Victor had not just called the local precinct. He had escalated the threat level to the maximum, utilizing the emergency ping I triggered earlier to guide a fully armed tactical response unit directly to our coordinates. Half a dozen heavily armored officers swarmed rapidly down the stairs, their weapons drawn, and their tactical lights sweeping every inch of the flooded basement. The chaotic freezing water did not slow them down for a second. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. Two officers immediately broke off from the formation, splashing heavily through the rising water to secure the perimeter of Rachel's medical cot. They formed a physical shield around my unconscious daughter. The remaining officers descended directly onto Derek. He barely had time to raise his hands in a gesture of surrender before they hit him. They swarmed him, driving him face first down into the freezing concrete floor. Heavy tactical boots pinned his shoulders and legs to the ground. They twisted his arms violently behind his back, securing his wrists with thick industrial zip ties. Derek let out a muffled scream as his face was pressed relentlessly into the rising water. The arrogant real estate broker was immobilized, surrounded by a wall of black armor and blinding flashlights. Victor walked slowly down the stairs behind the tactical team, ignoring the freezing water soaking the cuffs of his trousers. He looked around the flooded medical cell, his sharp eyes taking in the broken trapdoor, the shattered syringe, the roaring water main, and finally Derek's broken form pinned to the ground. Victor looked over at me standing fiercely beside my daughter's cot and gave a slow, respectful nod. The long, terrifying nightmare was over, and the destruction of Derek's life had just officially begun. The chaos of the tactical breach transformed the freezing, flooded basement into a blinding theater of flashing lights and shouting voices. The heavy splashing of water echoed against the thick cinder block walls as more personnel flooded down the narrow concrete stairwell. Victor stood near the shattered trapdoor, directing the flow of the emergency response teams, with the calm, unwavering authority of a man who had seen the darkest corners of human depravity. Right behind the heavily armored tactical unit, a dedicated team of emergency medical technicians rushed into the subterranean cell. They carried heavy orange trauma bags, portable oxygen tanks, and a rigid spine board. They splashed through the rising icy water, their intense focus locked entirely on the dark corner where I had desperately concealed my daughter. I stepped back, my chest heaving with exhaustion, allowing the highly trained professionals to take over the rescue. They moved with a beautiful, synchronized urgency. Two medics carefully pulled away the heavy, dust-covered canvas tarp I had used to hide Rachel from the monster who intended to destroy her mind. They shined their small diagnostic penlights into her unresponsive eyes, rapidly calling out her incredibly weak vital signs over the deafening noise of the rushing water. One paramedic quickly secured a cervical collar around her fragile neck, while another meticulously removed the remnants of the heavy leather restraints binding her wrists to the rusted medical cot. They moved her onto the rigid extraction board, with extreme care strapping her down securely to prevent any further physical trauma during the steep ascent. I watched them lift her out of the freezing floodwaters, carrying her battered body toward the stairs. A profound, overwhelming wave of pure relief washed over my aching bones. My daughter was finally safe. She was out of his control. I turned my attention away from the departing medical team and looked back across the ruined, chaotic room. Derek was completely pinned to the flooded concrete floor. 4 heavily armored tactical officers held him down relentlessly, their knees pressing firmly into his back and shoulders. The freezing water swirled violently around his face, soaking his ruined designer clothes and washing away the last remnants of his arrogant, polished facade. He thrashed wildly against the thick plastic zip ties binding his wrists together behind his back, his muscles straining against the absolute, uncompromising physical force of the arrest. He spat a mouthful of dirty water onto the floor and began to scream. He shrieked demands for his high-priced attorney, howling that his civil rights were being egregiously violated. He twisted his neck, glaring up at the commanding officers, spitting furious lies into the cold air. He claimed that I was the criminal, that I had brutally attacked him, without provocation, and that he was merely a victim of my violent, senile delusions. But his frantic, desperate lies fell on completely deaf ears. Victor stepped out of the shadows and calmly handed the lead tactical commander a sealed waterproof digital drive containing every single piece of encrypted financial evidence, every forged medical document, and the pristine audio recording of Derek's complete, unadulterated confession. The commander looked down at the pathetic, thrashing man on the floor with absolute disgust. He roughly hauled Derek to his feet, ignoring the frantic protests. Derek was bleeding from a shallow cut on his forehead, his face pale and contorted, with a sickening mixture of rage and terror. He knew the illusion was entirely shattered, but his narcissistic mind simply refused to accept the reality of his total defeat. I walked slowly across the flooded basement, my heavy work boots splashing through the icy water. The tactical officers parted slightly, allowing me to approach the man who had tried to systematically destroy my family. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him. I did not raise my hands. I did not shout. I stood perfectly still, radiating a deep, cold calmness that completely unsettled him. Derek glared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a venomous, trapped fury. He opened his mouth to spit another vicious threat, but I raised my hand slightly, silencing him instantly. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance until my face was only inches from his. I lowered my voice to a sharp, quiet whisper, ensuring that only he could hear the absolute finality of my words over the surrounding chaos. You filed official court documents claiming I had severe Alzheimer's disease to legally steal my granddaughter. I whispered, watching his eyes widen slightly. I want to thank you for doing that. Your arrogance made you sloppy, Derek. You see, my lawyer Mitchell used your exact emergency ex parte filing against you this morning. By officially submitting fraudulent medical claims to a sitting judge in an active attempt to bypass the established rules of the trust, you successfully triggered a deeply embedded moral turpitude and fraud penalty clause that I personally wrote into the foundation of Rachel's estate years ago. The entire $5 million trust fund has been permanently frozen by the federal authorities. The offshore gambling syndicate you owe your life to is currently watching the news. They know the money is gone. They are going to be waiting for you inside those walls, Derek. You have absolutely nothing left. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of ashen gray. The sheer magnitude of his absolute failure finally penetrated his delusional mind. His knees buckled, his entire body going limp, as the terrifying reality of his violent, impending future crushed his spirit. The officers dragged his dead weight toward the stairs, hauling him out of the flooded basement and into the cold, unforgiving light of the flashing police sirens waiting outside. I stood in the dark, silent cell for a long moment, listening to the rushing water, finally breathing the clean air of victory. Months later, the nightmare was a fading memory. I sold the suburban house tainted by his presence. We packed our lives, leaving illusions behind. I purchased a massive, quiet ranch deep in the beautiful wilderness of Montana. It was a fortress of peace, disconnected from polite high society. Rachel is recovering beautifully. The dangerous chemical fog has entirely lifted from her brilliant mind, replaced by a radiant, returning clarity. She spends her afternoons walking through the tall, green grass, surrounded by the gentle presence of our rescue horses, and breathing in the crisp, fresh mountain air. The deep emotional scars are slowly fading, healing under the steady warmth of absolute safety and unconditional love. And Lily has finally found her voice again. The selective mutism that locked her in silence has completely broken. Her bright, beautiful laughter now echoes joyously through the grand wooden halls of our new home, replacing the terrible, muffled scratching in the dark. We survived the absolute worst kind of betrayal imaginable. We rebuilt our shattered lives from the ground up, entirely abandoning the concept of bitter vengeance. Instead, we constructed our new reality with impenetrable boundaries, protecting our peace with the fierce, unwavering strength of a family that has stared directly into the eyes of pure evil and walked away completely victorious. The most dangerous threats to our families rarely break through the front window wearing a mask. They walk through the front door, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a perfect, charming smile. Evil thrives in the polite silence of society, hiding behind the titles of husband, provider, or caretaker. As a parent, your intuition is a biological alarm system forged by a lifetime of unconditional love. Never ignore the quiet scratching in the dark just because someone tells you the house is completely safe. True protection requires the supreme courage to look past the illusion and face the ugly truth. If this story reminded you to always trust your gut when it comes to your family's safety, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever uncovered a painful truth hidden behind a perfect smile? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one.